My name is Cajsa Unnbom, and I work at the Olof Palme International Center as an advisor in climate and the environment. And Olof Palmecenter is the Swedish labor movement's umbrella organization for international solidarity and advocacy. So what we do is we support movements that are working for democracy, human rights, peace, and social justice in different parts of the world, also in the Balkans. First of all, I want to just briefly talk about what is happening to our planet and to the natural world. And as we go into that, I want us to keep in mind what the Earth is. And quite simply, the Earth is our life support system, right? It provides us with all of the things that we need to survive. For example, the oxygen that we're breathing right now. We have the rainforests and the oceans to thank for that. And maybe you have trees outside of your window right now. And if you do, they're standing there protecting your health because they remove some of the pollution from the air and they protect us from getting asthma and heart attacks and other diseases. And we also depend on the Earth for energy, food, drinking water, materials for our clothes and our houses, ingredients for many medicines, even Western medicine, stress relief and recovery, and much more. So, when this life support system starts breaking down, when whole chunks are coming off, that is actually something that affects us as humans a great deal. It's not just a matter of nature out there. It affects our life situation very directly. And about 10 years ago, a team of scientists asked people in several countries if they thought that things will turn out better for the next generation. And this is something that people have always hoped for, right? A better future, especially young people who really should have that sense of possibility. But it turned out that most of the people who responded thought that the next generations will be worse off than those who are adults today. So a lot of people are losing hope that things will be okay. And this fear of where we're heading, it's not just that something that ordinary people feel. It is also something that you hear now from the people running our governments and our economies. And that is what you're looking at now. Every year, the World Economic Forum releases something that they call a global risk report. And it outlines what power holders in politics and business consider to be the biggest global risks. And this year, 6 out of the 7 biggest risks had to do with climate and the environment. In the top right square there, you can see sort of the threats that are both considered to be most likely to happen and that would have the most serious consequences. So water crisis is red here, as you see, but it's also very much related to the climate crisis. And the most serious risk that they identified was that the world will fail at taking action to combat the climate crisis. And here's what they said about that. The near-term impacts of climate change add up to a planetary emergency that will include loss of life, social and geopolitical tensions, and negative economic impacts. Right, so these are the leaders of our societies, right? And as of now, humans have already heated the Earth by about 1.1 degrees Celsius. And we're living in, the Guinness World of dramatic consequences, and I will mention 8 of these. So first of all, we see, of course, more heat waves, extreme heat, and drought. And that leads to more fires. These pictures are from Australia and from the US, but there have obviously been fires happening also in Europe and other places. And a third consequence is that storms become more frequent and also more violent. This is from the Philippines this week. They've had 3 typhoons so far this month. And a fourth consequence is that the oceans are rising. And that, combined with stronger storms, leads to more flooding. And the UN says now that the oceans might rise by 1.1 meters by the end of the century if we fail to curb climate emissions in time. But many say that, this is a very modest estimate, that we could be looking at much more than that, especially now that, all of Greenland seems about to melt. So many coastal cities are in trouble, and people like to build cities by the coast. And impact number 5 is that more people will be hungry. That's natural because crops are drying up and animals are dying because of lack of feed and water. And it's also because pests like these locusts that you see in this picture thrive in the new climate. And in my country, Sweden, we lost almost half of our crops in the very dry summer of 2018. And climate crisis also means that water is becoming more scarce, drinking water, that is. And if there's no clean water, of course, people will drink whatever water they can find. And dirty water is a big reason why 500,000 children under 5 get diarrhea and die each year. And all of these things that I mentioned mean that more people have to leave their homes. So today we have about 80 million involuntary migrants in the world. And that is already twice as many as there were when I was a child. But a new report estimates that in 2050, 1.2 billion people may have to leave their homes because of ecological threats, if we don't act decisively to choose another path. And lastly, the climate crisis is also impacting our health, our bodies. And that makes total sense since, it threatens access to our most basic needs. Food, water, and a safe environment, for example. And we also see that extreme heat and heat waves are taking lives, also thousands of lives in Europe, actually. And obviously, air pollution needs to go on this list. 9 out of 10 people in the world breathe toxic air today. And this is connected to the climate crisis, because as it gets warmer, you get more smog on the ground. And also the things that release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere and damage the climate, like traffic or coal plants and forest fires, they also pollute the air and they damage our bodies. So air pollution causes stroke, cardiovascular disease, like heart attacks and lung cancer. And this image that you see here shows a morning commuter in Belgrade who's wearing a face mask, and it's lighting up in red. And what that means is that the level of toxins in the air exceeds safe levels 5 times over. So it is dangerous just to go outside and breathe. And a hotter world also leads to the spread of infectious diseases. And all of this has caused the medical paper, The Lancet, to state that climate destruction is the biggest health threat of our century. And they write in a report that every child born today will be profoundly affected by climate change. Because they're going to live their entire lives in this more dangerous world that we're leaving behind. So already at 1.1 degrees of warming, we see very serious effects. And the hotter it gets, the worse it gets, of course. And at the end of the century, we might see, not just one catastrophe at the time, but several catastrophes of this kind in one place. So the natural question to ask then is, where are we heading? How much warming are we heading for? And as you know, most countries in the world have signed the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement says that we need to keep global warming well below 2 degrees, but aiming for 1.5 degrees. Unfortunately, the world is not living up to that promise at the moment. At the end of the century, we will have reached about 2.8 degrees. And that is if all nations actually do make the reductions that they have pledged so far under the Paris Agreement. But if we just continue as we do now, that will mean about 3 degrees of warming by the end of this century. And you see the darker blue bar there at the side, that shows a probable interval. Because this is not exact, we can't say exactly, but that's the range that we're looking at. And as you see, there's a very real risk that we will end up with over 4 degrees by 2100. And that sounds maybe far away, but that is within my child's lifetime. So without radical change, we will hit 2 degrees well before the end of this century. And we need to remember here that even if the Paris Agreement aims for no more than 2 degrees, that is not a safe level. Actually, the most vulnerable countries in the world, the poorer countries, fought to make 1.5 degrees the binding target. But the richer countries with bigger emissions, they wouldn't have it. And since the Paris Agreement was passed, there's also been more research that shows just how dangerous it is to go over 2 degrees. So the United Nations Climate Panel is now very clear that we have to do everything we can to reach the target of 1.5 degrees. And when I first started hearing about this, I thought, what is the big deal? I mean, half a degree, how much can it matter? But of course, it makes a huge difference in terms of impacts. For example, this May, there was a study released that showed that for every extra degree of warming, 1 billion people will end up outside of the temperature range that our species can endure. So it will be too hot to live there. And if you're rich, you might be able to adapt to that. You can fly in food because you can't grow any food there, and you can live in air-conditioned homes and transport yourself in air-conditioned cars, etc. But most people can't do that. Most people in these places would have to leave and go somewhere else. So half a degree and a degree makes a lot of difference. And so the 1.5 degree target gives us a much better future than 2 degrees. But I've also got to be honest that the chance of actually reaching 1.5 degrees is very quickly slipping out of our hands. Several scientists are now saying that they don't believe that we're going to make it. It's very, very unlikely. And of course, if we had started to take action sooner, when we learned about climate change, like 30 years ago and even more, we would have made it. But the leadership in the emitting countries and companies waited too long. In fact, not just waited, but made it actively worse. But I don't want to say, give up on climate action. Of course not. We can't do that because we can still avoid the very worst scenarios if we act forcefully to cut emissions. So just remember that every 1/10 of a degree matters. Every 1/10 of a degree of warming that we can prevent will save lives. Right, so that's in broad strokes what is happening to our climate. But I also want to bring up what is happening with the natural world, with the animals and plants, the life on this planet. So let's imagine that someone 10,000 years ago managed to round up all the mammals and weigh them. And then it would have looked something like this. 99% of the mass would have been wild animals, and 1% would have been humans. But now we live in a world where it looks very differently. 60% of the mass is made up of our farm animals and pets. And humans stand for 36%, and the wild animals are only 4%. So the groups pets and goats are both bigger than the wild animals, all of the other animals. So what has happened in between these two pictures is that humans have come to dominate the earth. We have pushed a lot of other animals out of existence. And this is actually quite a recent development. I mean, most of this happened during our lifetime. Just since 1970, 2/3 of all animals on Earth have disappeared. So 2/3 of all animals on Earth are already gone. And the main reason is agriculture. And a particular form of agriculture, I should say. We're talking about the intensive, single crop, very toxic form of agriculture here. And of course, we need to produce food, but we need to do it in a better and less wasteful way. And this is a key issue to solve the climate crisis. It's a key issue to solve the crisis for our biodiversity. Right now, for example, the world produces a lot of meat and dairy, mainly for consumers in richer countries. And this requires a lot of farmland and a lot of water and a lot of emissions as well. And a couple of years ago, Science magazine published a study that came to the conclusion that if the world transitioned to a mainly plant-based diet, we could reduce our use of farmland by more than 75%. So that equals an area as big as the US, China, EU, and Australia together. And that would, certainly give wildlife and nature some space to recover. And we could produce enough food for everyone. Other threats to biodiversity, to animals and plants, include, cutting down old forests and replacing them with large-scale forest plantations, as well as overhunting and unsustainable fishing. And we are also, of course, losing species to climate change because many animals, it's happening so fast that many animals and plants, they don't have time to adapt. So they disappear. And humanity's increasing pressure on nature and demand for meat also means that new and dangerous diseases can make the leap from other animals to humans. And of course, COVID-19 is a prime example of that. As scientists are saying that, new pandemics are waiting around the corner if people keep treating the planet and the animals on it the way that they do now. It's just a matter of time. And we also see that industrial farming with, all the toxic pesticides that are used there has also led to a catastrophic decline in insects. And these insects, of course, help us produce all of the things that we eat. So, and the things that grow in nature. So without insects, our ecosystems will break down. And scientists are now saying that if insects keep disappearing at this pace, they might be completely gone within 100 years. And when the Earth loses more than 3 out of 4 species in a geologically short period, that is, a short period from a planetary perspective, it is called a mass extinction. And this kind of event has only happened 5 times in the last 540 million years. And the last time it happened was when the dinosaurs went extinct. But now there are signs that we are entering the 6th mass extinction. Over 1 million species are threatened with extinction, and science is telling us that this loss of life all around us is a threat to of the same magnitude as the climate crisis. You know, they're saying, here's a quote from a recent major report on the loss of biodiversity. And they're saying that we are eroding the very foundations of our economies, our livelihoods, our food security, our health, and the quality of life worldwide. And they also say that we only have a short time to reverse this trend before there will be major consequences for life on Earth. So those of us who are adults today, we were born into a world where there was still a lot of wild animals and natural landscapes. But the world that our children are growing up in is a much poorer place. And our grandchildren may never get to know, you know, many of the amazing animals that we take for granted. So what I would like us to remember from this part is that, you know, life on this planet, including our own existence, is in acute danger. Right, so we've looked at what's happening to the Earth, and we've looked at how this affects people, you know, on a general level. But now I thought we could also take a closer look at how this affects the work for social and economic justice, the work that you are involved in. And I know a lot of us link our work in this area to the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030. And we're used to seeing them like this, you know, all 17 goals next to each other in separate boxes of equal importance. But some of you might have also seen this graph, which was developed by the Research Institute Stockholm Resilience Center. And what it does is that it aims to show how the different kinds of goals relate to each other. And then we get this beautiful wedding cake. With the biosphere, which is the living world, at the bottom, as the largest piece, and then human society on top of that, and economy as a smaller piece on top of society. And I think this is a very useful picture because it illustrates that a functioning planet is the foundation of the other goals. So, you know, we can't have nice things like reduced inequalities and zero hunger if we don't have a stable climate, if life is disappearing off the planet. You know, we can't have, if we don't have healthy ecosystems on land and below water, then, you know, we don't have clean water to drink. And I think too often in the discussion that the cake is flipped upside down. You know, economic growth is the target. And then what happens to the living world is seen as a side issue, you know, something for green-minded people to sort of go and worry and protest about. And it is as if there were no limitations in terms of what we can take from the planet or what we can dump on the planet, how much waste it can deal with. But in the words of Johan Rockström, who is the director of Stockholm Resilience Center, you know, the planet sets the boundaries and they are non-negotiable. And looking at this wedding cake, you know, it's very obvious that the climate and environmental emergency is profoundly affecting our opportunities to reach progressive goals. And we're going to have a look at some of these in turn. So let's begin with democracy and human rights. You know, what happens to those when society is subjected to repeated shocks? And we're getting some hints from what is happening during the pandemic at the moment. In the Philippines, for example, the president just, you know, shut down a lot of independent media houses. And in Hungary, President Orban gave himself the right to rule the country personally. So authoritarian regimes will try to use crises as an excuse to restrict democracy. And we are, as I said, headed for many, many more crises. And then we have the right-wing nationalists, right? They are very good at channeling and flaming people's fear and insecurity and turning that into hostility towards certain groups of others. And, you know, it's of course no secret what they would like to do with the rights of ethnic and religious minorities, with the freedom of women and LGBTQ people, or how they feel about, you know, union influence, for example. And I want to mention an example of a crisis where the far right, you know, at least in Europe, has succeeded in moving its positions forward, and that is the war in Syria. You know, when millions of Syrians had to flee, and, you know, some of them came to Europe. And quite quickly, the debate took a turn to the right. Refugees were dehumanized. And at least in Sweden, you know, I remember there was a quite mainstream presidential candidate that was posing in hunting clothes with the caption, "Protect the borders," as if he was going out to sort of shoot refugees who were trying to enter. And the human rights of asylum seekers were restricted even more as a result of this new climate in the discussion. You know, many children were not allowed to be reunited with their parents, for example. And at one point, the right-wing populist government of Italy tried to prevent lifeboats from helping people in the Mediterranean. And they actually got the support of the rest of the EU heads of state. And this happened just days after a boat full of migrants had sunk off the Libyan coast with hundreds of casualties, including many children. And I've gotten the feedback that, you know, isn't this a sidetrack? Aren't we supposed to be talking about the climate here? Why are we talking about refugees? But it is actually a key issue when we are talking about the climate crisis and human rights. And we need to remember that, you know, as Europeans, that the Mediterranean is already the most deadly border in the world. You know, thousands of people drown there every year, mostly Black and brown people. So large groups in Europe would rather let these people die than have them come here. And as you know, the EU is also paying countries like Libya to stop migrants, even though people are subjected to extreme violence and assault there, according to Doctors Without Borders and Amnesty and others. So that is already happening. And as I mentioned before, you know, quite soon, many more people will be forced to seek out a safer place to live, especially if we don't do enough to stop the climate destruction. So, you know, how will those countries that have, for the most part, caused this crisis deal with the millions or billions of people who are forced to abandon their homes because of them? You know, will they say, welcome, of course you can come here, you know, it's the least we can do? Or will we get what has been called climate apartheid? And what that means is that people who can afford to pay their way out of the worst effects sit comfortably in their, you know, air-conditioned homes and build higher and higher walls while everybody else is left outside to sort of fend for themselves. So that is a question that is a serious question that we need to bear in mind. You know, how can we protect fundamental values of solidarity, such as justice and everyone's equal right to life, in a much more chaotic world? And one final point about democracy. You know, in a democracy, a fundamental idea is that people get to choose. You know, voters decide on a policy for the coming years, and then, you know, a few years down the line, if the voters then feel like, okay, that's a crap policy, they can just vote for another one. But in this case, we are making decisions for all future generations. So, because we are the ones who can influence how our societies act while there is still a chance to avoid the worst effects. So the decisions that we make in the coming months and the coming years will determine the conditions for life on Earth several thousand years into the future. And they will make the difference between life and death for millions of people and other species on the planet. So, you know, is it democratic to make a choice like that condemns people to horrible things. Right, so the conditions for workers, what effects do we see there? Well, one direct consequence is that more and more people will be working in extreme heat. And high temperatures are a well-known occupational health and safety risk. And the natural way that you can cope with this as a worker is to slow the pace or work fewer hours. But this also means that we get less done, and then also a lower income. And certain groups of workers are particularly exposed. And I'm talking here about small-scale farmers, people who work in agriculture. And the vast majority of these small-scale farmers are women. And then we have all the other people who work outside doing hard physical jobs, like construction workers. And people who work in hot factories are also a risk. Or they are at risk, not a risk, sorry. And we also have migrant workers who all usually don't have the same protection or the same rights in the workplace. And as we've seen, poorer health is a consequence of the climate and environmental crisis. So those who are affected by that, they end up losing working hours, and you have to pay more for healthcare. And going back to the example of toxic air, that is especially a problem for people working in cities or close to industries. And I've been told that this is a big issue in many countries in the Balkans. And what that means, it's very concrete. It's that more workers and their families will suffer from asthma, from heart disease, lung cancer, and stroke. And of course, climate disasters also disrupt people's opportunities to make a living. If your town is flooded, it's likely that you can't go to work for a while. Or if your shop is destroyed. And it might also become more difficult to make ends meet, to make your salary last. If the price of food goes up as a result of the food supply becoming less reliable, which is also happening as we see. So in 2010, for example, there was a heat wave in Russia. And since Russia is a major producer of the world's wheat, that resulted in a global shortage. And prices of wheat went up by 90% due to that. And of course, that illustrates that today we have very global supply chains. If you get a disruption at one end due to, say, a drought or a flood, that can very quickly disrupt production further down the line in another country. And that, of course, affects local workers. But these supply chains will also be affected by changes in demand. Higher income countries consume a very large share of the world's goods and services today. And if they take their commitments to reducing emissions seriously, and let's hope that they do, it will mean a steep change in what and how much is consumed. So these global shifts in demand will certainly be felt at the other end of the supply chain, like in clothes factories in Southeast Asia, for example. So this is a major task for local unions, to be prepared and to be proactive so that their members can make a living in the near future. And we will talk about that when we get to solutions. Right, so what is the effect on global economic development and the fight against poverty? Well, we just talked about how extreme heat and how this affects workers. And this will reduce the productivity of the workforce. The UN panel on climate change is predicting that profits will drop by more than 20% in the affected sectors from the middle of the century, so quite soon. And they estimate that as early as 10 years from now, this drop in productivity will cause losses of more than $2 billion globally. So less money will be coming in at the same time as more money is going out. there's no doubt that economies all over the world will be hit by enormous expenses for material damage due to storms, droughts, fires, and floods. And we will also see huge economic costs because of poorer health. And at the moment, we're seeing the effects of a single virus on the world's economies. And as I said, as people continue to disrupt the climate and the environment, we can expect many more epidemics like this one. And when it comes to eliminating poverty and achieving economic equality, it is pretty obvious that the odds of succeeding are looking much worse as the basis of our existence is being eroded. Because even if the effects are felt in all countries and will be felt more and more, they will not affect everyone equally, of course. Low-income countries in already hot regions will be hit the hardest. And so the worst effects will happen there, and they also have fewer resources for dealing with those consequences. Because, obviously, if you have to spend most of your income on the basics, like food, clean water, medicine, somewhere to live, then of course you have less money to invest in things like hurricane-proof roofs, or storm shutters, or solar power generators and first aid kits. And you probably won't be able to afford an emergency radio or a satellite phone that could warn you of incoming disasters. And you don't have home insurance to help you rebuild your house after the fact. And to top that off, poorer populations often live in areas and houses that are more vulnerable to disasters because it is cheaper. And they also have fewer opportunities to sort of take the car or the train and get themselves to safety. So the climate crisis really widens the economic gaps, both between countries and within countries. So what about peace? What is happening there? Well, when resources that are essential to life, such as arable land and drinking water, start to become scarce, and when many people are forced to flee their homes, this translates into a greater risk of conflict between groups and between countries, right? And the Institute for Economics and Peace recently published a report called the Ecological Threat Register. And that report shows that there is a strong link between the least peaceful and the most ecologically threatened areas in the world. And this also speaks for making ecocide, environmental destruction on a large scale, into a crime against peace. Today, it's perfectly legal to destroy people's living environment. It is business as usual. And as you recall, UN's refugee body also highlights climate destruction as a contributing factor to many of today's conflicts. And they mention Syria, Darfur, Somalia, Iraq, and the Lake Chad region, for example. The war in Syria, for example, that was preceded by a 5-year drought that created 1.5 million domestic refugees and really ramped up political instability in the country. So the climate and environmental crises pose a clear threat to peace. And so we're going to look at what specifically is happening to women's rights. And of course, these are human rights too. I'm just, zooming in on them specifically. And as we know, poor people are the hardest hit by the climate crisis. And the majority of poor people are women. Women earn less and women own less. And that makes it harder to prepare for coming shocks. And it makes you more vulnerable when disasters do occur. So consider that only 13% of all land in the world is owned by women. If something in a disaster were to happen to a woman's husband or brother or father, would she be able to keep the family home? And can she continue to work on the family's land? Studies show that it is harder for poorer women to recover their economic positions than it is for poorer men. And it's not just women's incomes or homes that are at risk. Women are also more likely to die in natural disasters. If we look at the tsunami in the Indian Ocean in 2004, it killed 4 times as many women as men. And in many cases, the women had stayed behind to search for children or other, family members that they were caring for. And in other cases, they had never gotten to learn how to swim. And this pattern is not unique to, what happened on that very tragic day. It was confirmed in a study that analyzed disasters from 141 countries over 2 decades. And another extra burden on women when it comes to the climate crisis is that men's violence against women tends to rise during times of crises. When the Caribbean was hit by several hurricanes a few years ago, there was a clear spike in sexual violence afterwards. And we're seeing this also during the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. And related to this, disasters also put many women and girls in situations where they are more vulnerable to exploitation. After Typhoon Haiyan hit Southeast Asia, local newspapers wrote that climate change has created a new generation of trafficking victims, because traffickers had easier access to victims among the many women and children who had been displaced by that storm. And you also see that prostitution and trafficking are a risk for those women and girls who have to leave the countryside because, climate change means that there are not enough yields on the family land. So they have to go into the city to make an income. And some are also married off when the family can no longer sort of make ends meet. And another way that women are more impacted by the climate crisis is that in the wake of a disaster, women are still expected to take care of all the household chores. So when the wells are subsequently polluted by bacteria like E. coli bacteria, salmonella, cholera, yellow fever and the like, which often happens after disasters, women are the ones who are most exposed. And then we have the lack of water that follows on the heels of the climate crisis. That also has a greater impact on women because women are usually responsible for the household farming, as we remember, as well as for collecting water, collecting firewood, and cooking. So when water starts running low, it is women and girls who have to walk farther and farther away to fetch water. And then they're also at greater risk of being subjected to violence and assault along the way. And there's also, a cost here. If you have to spend 8 hours a day fetching water, there's not a whole lot of time left to go to school, for example, or to participate in the village's decision-making. And procedures like childbirth and abortion also become more risky if there is no clean water. So all of these things explain why women are harder hit by the climate and environmental crisis. But at the same time, we also have less political influence, right? Over decisions about how we're going to deal with this situation. So it's high time that we did something about this. And I think that this quote from Antonio Guterres, who is the Secretary General of the UN, sort of summarizes the impact that the climate crisis has on opportunities for progressive development. And he says that, I see many problems, but none loom so large as climate change. It makes all other progressive goals harder to reach. And, to conclude this part about the challenges, I just want to add that, these crises will lead to major changes. No matter what, changes are coming. So the only question is how. Will they take place chaotically, as the consequences just come washing over us? Or will we be prepared? Will we do this in a planned manner? So this is not something that we can choose to ignore. And the situation requires, structural changes in all parts of society. And we need to be part of it if we want to say in how it's done. And something that I personally feel very strongly about is that, what we choose to do in this planetary, in the face of this planetary challenge, is also a choice about whose lives and opinions actually count. So we know that women and young people are more concerned about the climate crisis, and that they're taking action to a higher degree. And I've also seen polls where people of color are more concerned. And we also know that the lives of millions of people are at stake. And again, the majority of them will be Black and brown people. So, if climate and the loss of life's fabric are seen as issues that can be brushed aside, that also tells us something about how these groups are valued. Now, I know that many organizations in civil society are struggling with so many important issues already. And I understand, that it might feel like, we can't take on anything else. I mean, this too, right? But the idea here is not that women's organizations should or the labor movement for that matter, should just, drop their core concerns. Rather, it's about looking at how climate and the environment affect the groups that we are working for, affect the questions that we are working for, and pushing for a transition where we are in our context, and bringing the knowledge that we have to the table. Because we can cut emissions and give women better work opportunities. We can green our economy and have healthier cities where we're not exposed to toxic air. And this idea that we should be working towards several goals at the same time, that is, of course, one of the fundamental ideas in Agenda 2030, as you know, because we simply don't have time to take them on one by one. So the most important message I want you to take from this part is that, we need to get engaged in the struggle for climate and a healthy environment in order to have a chance of achieving equality and human rights. So we're going to talk about how we can take action against the climate and environmental crises and inequality at the same time. And as we saw in the last part, we need to get engaged in the struggle for the planet in order to achieve social and economic justice. However, it also works the other way around, right? We need social and economic justice if we are to win the battle for our planet. Because to bring about the green transition of our societies as quickly as we need, and on the scale that we need, an incredible number of people need to participate. And they need to be enthusiastic about it too. And we will never be able to build such a broad movement unless people can see that there's a vision here about a better life together. So the transition must have answers to the problems that people are experiencing in their lives. You can't ask people who are struggling with poverty or discrimination to put those things aside, because now we're going to save the climate first. But rather, we need to see how inequality and the crisis for our planet go hand in hand, and how the solutions can do so as well. So simply put, the climate and environmental crisis is the world's biggest justice crisis. And there's data to prove it too. This September, Oxfam and Stockholm Environment Institute published a report called Confronting Carbon Inequality. And it really is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand the climate crisis. And what the report does is that it zeroes in on what happened between 1990 and 2015. And that was a period when emissions rose sharply. In fact, during those 25 years, humanity released more carbon than in the previous 140 years. So the climate crisis really accelerated during this time. And what the researchers did is that they looked at who was responsible for all of these emissions. And it turned out that the richest 10% in the world releases as much carbon as the rest of the world combined. The richest 10% you see is the lighter gray ball, and the rest of the world is the light green ball. And if you look even closer at the richest 1%, they release more than twice as much carbon as the poorest half of humanity. You see them as the black and the dark green ball in the diagram. So the richest people in the world are really driving this crisis. And the world's most important budget right now is the carbon budget. The carbon budget is the total amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit if we want a reasonable chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. And you often hear the argument that, it's a nice budget, of course, but we can't stay within that because we have to let emissions rise if we want conditions to improve for ordinary people, for the general masses. But the truth is that a large proportion of our remaining carbon budget has been wasted on increasing consumption among a very small group of the world's richest people, not on elevating all people to a decent standard of living. Let's debunk this argument. To be fair, extreme poverty has diminished. At the same time, however, inequality has increased in most countries in the world. Actually, even though the global economy doubled in this period between 1990 and 2015, almost half of all people in the world, so every other human, remains poor. And the definition of poverty being that you earn less than $5.50 per day. So growth is not an efficient way to reduce poverty. In fact, it would take 200 years at the current rate to lift everyone above that poverty line. Do we want to wait 200 years? And our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees is almost used up. It will run out in 2030 if we let emissions rise again to the previous levels before the pandemic. So in order to tackle the climate crisis, we need to end the extreme inequality that is depleting our climate budget really, really fast. So we need to focus on what the rich are doing. And this is not a unreasonable ask. If the richest 10% lived like the average European, we could cut global emissions by 25% just like that. So it is essential that we bring policies for redistribution and actually some class struggle into the climate work. So on that note, let's talk about climate justice. Climate justice means that those who have generated the greatest emissions need to take responsibility in relationship to those who have hardly contributed to the crisis but are now suffering the worst consequences. And this means that the countries that have been burning fossil fuels for decades, sometimes even centuries, need to reduce their emissions faster than others. And in this way, low-income countries will have a little more time to build up the necessary infrastructure, like hospitals, railways, power grids, and so on. And the rich countries also need to contribute money and technology to help these countries undertake this development in the greenest way possible. And not least, richer countries also have to make sure that the poorer and more affected countries have the chance to prepare for what is coming, or in many cases already happening. And this is not some utopian dream. This is all in the Paris Agreement as the principle of justice, even though the rich countries still don't live up to it. And movements that are working for climate justice also want the big emitters, nation states and fossil fuel companies, both private-owned and state-owned, to pay their climate debt. And this is not in the Paris Agreement because the richer countries didn't want that. And there was a lot of lobbying to not have that in there. But what climate debt means is that richer countries need to pay and companies need to pay compensation to the most heavily affected countries for having unleashed all of these devastating consequences on the world, knowing full well what they were doing. And another climate justice demand is that the rights of climate refugees should be secured, and that the rights of indigenous peoples who protect a lot of the world's biodiversity must be respected. And very excitingly, climate justice also means that we need to work, or that we need much more democratic participation in decisions about how to deal with this crisis. So what that means is that people in the global south, indigenous people, women and young people who are experiencing the greatest consequences must be given leading roles in this transition. And there are actually some exciting models for letting ordinary people take part in decisions on the climate transition. I know that in France, for example, the government has set up citizens' councils to discuss how a fair climate transition should be implemented. So they are giving advice to their governments. So very briefly, that is what climate justice means. Now we're going to take a look at how quickly countries need to act to cut their emissions according to this principle of justice. And this, very quickly gets confusing because you hear a lot of different dates with regard to, when countries should become carbon neutral. That means reach net zero emissions. And the EU and several others has set 2050 as the deadline. But there are three big problems with this official target. And one is that it doesn't live up to the justice principle, where richer countries are supposed to cut their emissions faster. And another is that it doesn't include the huge emissions caused by our consumption. It just pretends that those aren't there and dumps them on the producing countries, even though they're producing it for us. And a third problem is that these targets are founded on a bit of magical thinking. When you hear dates like 2050 from higher income, high emission countries, it builds on an assumption that we will succeed in achieving negative emissions. And I want to tell you about this, even though it's a bit technical, because it's so important in terms of what we're striving for. What negative emissions means is that first, we plan to release a dangerous amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Far too much to keep global heating at a reasonable, safe level. And then we're going to remove it from the atmosphere again. And if you make this assumption, the diagrams look much better. It looks as though you have decades rather than years to get your emissions down to zero. And this is much more pleasant to tell, the voters or the business community. The problem is just that the technology to do this on the enormous scale that would be needed does not exist today. So what we're actually doing is we're pushing the problem ahead of us, and we're leaving it up to our children to sort of invent this magic technology and clean up our mess. And a less risky and more responsible approach would be to just, reduce emissions directly instead. And then we need fast, comprehensive changes of a type never previously seen in every aspect of society, as the UN writes in their report about what we need to do to reach the 1.5 degree target. So, in other words, that is a transformation of all parts of the labor market. And this leads us to the topic of just transition. And just transition is the trade union plan for how these huge changes are to be made. And I'm going to let Samantha Smith, who is the director of the Just Transition Center, just explain what a just transition means.
So a just transition is an idea that's been around for a couple of decades, initiated by the trade union movement. And it means that you bring the parties in the economy together, so that's workers, it's employers, and government, together in social dialogue to design the plans and the policies and the investments that are needed to transition from one kind of sector to another. So it's basically a process, but it's also a theory of change. So the idea of just transition for unions is that through the process of social dialogue, through the process of making plans how we can get companies that will thrive under 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, we can go further and faster together.
Right, so just to sum it up, just transition has to do with ensuring that all jobs, old and new, have to be green, with decent conditions and without excluding any workers or professions. And this is important, not just jobs in new and exciting technological sectors, but all jobs should be green. And when we update the labor market so fundamentally, we must also make sure that everyone receives a decent pay, good working conditions, and that they have the right to organize as in unions. So this is an ambitious plan to improve people's lives at the same time as we act for the climate. And there must also be a social safety net. There must be opportunities for further education for all workers who are affected. And another important cornerstone is that workers and their unions must also take part in the decisions about how this transition is to be made and find local solutions. Fundamentally, the change that we need to the labor market, that comprises 3 areas. And the first one is to create new green jobs in new sectors. And here you'll find, the renewable energy production, like solar and wind power, for example, but also work that has to do with making homes more energy efficient or restoring natural environments, producing food locally, or repairing and recycling services. And to get these new jobs, we need investments. And these investments also, have to be made with a gender perspective, because we've seen that they tend to go exclusively to male-dominated sectors, and women also have to get their share of these new green jobs. And I should add here that jobs in the welfare sector are also green jobs, because schools and healthcare and those things are essential to society, and they have a very low carbon footprint. So we need investments in that too. And the second part that you see here is climate adaptation of traditional sectors. And there are major changes needed in agriculture, in transport, in commerce, in construction. But as you remember, all sectors have to be climate-proofed in order to succeed with this transition. And the third and most difficult area is about sectors with very high emissions that we can't get rid of in time. And so these sectors must be reduced or phased out. And some examples are coal power and large parts of the airline industry, for example. So, some jobs will disappear and regions will be affected by that. However, the ILO calculates that if we make this fast green transition, that would create 24 million jobs. So overall, we get more good jobs out of it. So just quickly, why is a just transition important? Well, it means that more people can get behind climate action. It will be just extremely difficult to get people on board if they are afraid for their livelihoods. Then they risk becoming opponents to the entire project. And that is, we have a democratic nightmare. And just transition also lets us, do away with the false juxtaposition between jobs or the environment. We shouldn't have to choose. It must be jobs and the environment. So the role of the unions is not to sort of give artificial respiration to sectors that harm the planet and damage workers' opportunities to enjoy a good life, but rather the unions need to make sure that workers get a secure, a long-term, and a sustainable source of income. And they have to sort of go to the employers and say that you need to take the responsibility for your employees by investing in future-proofing your business. And just transition also means that the whole society shares the benefits and the costs of the transition. If we're asking some workers to quit their jobs and switch from one sector to another for the common good, then those people and their local communities must not be left to sort of deal with it themselves. We should be in this together. So just transition is the union way of working for an equal and green future, but there are a number of really inspiring things happening in the world of politics too. Like last year, the Democrats in the US put forth a proposition calling for a Green New Deal, which I'm sure you've read about. And that proposal was built on a manifesto that was prepared by civil society together with unions. And the Green Deal is a political plan for kickstarting a just transition with big investments. So it's about cutting emissions quickly enough to meet the Paris Agreement, combined with measures for social and economic justice. And I'm going to play a video clip with a greeting from the future from the politician Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's been working with this deal. Let's hope that this works.
The bullet train from New York to DC. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them, navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it, but people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. Anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start with how we got here. 1977, New York. A senior scientist named James Black made a presentation about how burning fossil fuels could eventually lead to global temperatures rising 4 or 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 2 years, one of the world's biggest supertankers was outfitted with a state-of-the-art lab to measure CO2 in the ocean, gathering more data about global warming. Guess who was doing all of this research? ExxonMobil, the oil and gas company. Oh yeah, Exxon knew this whole time, as did our politicians. 10 years later, James Hansen, NASA's top climate scientist, told Congress he was 99% certain that global warming was happening and caused by humans. That was 1988, the year before I was even born. So did Exxon listen to the science, including their own? Did they change business models, invest in renewables? No, the opposite. They knew and they doubled down. They and others spent millions setting up a network of lobby groups and think tanks to create doubt and denial about climate change. It was an effort designed to attack and dispute the very kind of science they themselves had been doing. And it worked. Politicians went to bat for fossil fuels, and these massive corporations kept digging and mining, drilling and fracking like there was no tomorrow. America became the biggest producer and consumer of oil in the world. Fossil fuel companies made hundreds of billions, while the public paid the lion's share to clean up their disasters. We lost a generation of time we'll never get back. Entire species will never get back. Natural wonders gone forever. And in 2017, Hurricane Maria destroyed the place where my family was from, Puerto Rico. It was like a climate bomb. It took as many American lives as 9/11. And in the next year, when I was elected to Congress, the world's leading climate scientists declared another emergency. They told us that we had 12 years left to cut our emissions in half, or hundreds of millions of people would be more likely to face food and water shortages, poverty, and death. 12 years to change everything. How we got around, how we fed ourselves, how we made our stuff, how we lived and worked, everything. The only way to do it was to transform our economy, which we already knew was broken, since the vast majority of wealth was going to just a small handful of people, and most folks were falling further and further behind. It was a true turning point. Lots of people gave up. They said we were doomed. But some of us remembered that as a nation, we'd been in peril before. The Great Depression, World War II, We knew from our history how to pull together to overcome impossible odds. And at the very least, we owed it to our children to try. The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing for the fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stopped being so scared of the future. We stopped being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, and in 2028, she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns. And now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.
Right. Yeah, we can be the kind. We can. If we can have a vision, we can also make it come true. So this proposal has been met with a lot of enthusiasm, actually, from voters. And now that the Democrats have won the election in the US, they can start rolling out this plan. Europe also has a Green New Deal, but it's less ambitious. The goal is to achieve almost zero emissions in 2050, as you remember, and that is 20 years after the American Green New Deal. And it also lacks the perspective of justice in a number of areas. Also, it is not sufficiently funded yet. At the same time, the EU is pouring 4 times as much money into unnecessary and destructive fossil gas projects, according to a new study that looked at this. But an interesting initiative to keep an eye out for is the invitation to a global Green New Deal, which is being drawn up now. And this will place very heavy emphasis on social and economic justice, both within and between countries. And there's a website for this that you can have a look at. It's called www.globalgnd.org. And I can post it in the chat later. Right. So there's no doubt that what needs to be done in order to protect our existence in this world is a truly enormous task. And you might ask, is it even possible? But then it might help to remember that people have succeeded at seemingly impossible things before. Like centuries ago, it was still a dream that in most places that women should be able to vote. The transatlantic slavery was once considered, a cornerstone of the global economy. And people said, we can't abolish that. And we've also seen that in extraordinary times like the Second World War, that societies have managed to make very fast transitions of their economies. And as Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. It actually also helps to bear in mind that change doesn't have to be made in small steps at a predictable, steady pace. It can also take place in giant leaps. And that happens when a critical mass of people start to believe that change is possible. And then, what was once considered impossible becomes the new normal. Of course, giant leaps can be good and bad. So we're facing a very real risk of planetary system collapse and of anti-democratic forces, seizing the opportunity to push their agendas. So we can't know what will happen in the future. What we can do, however, is to identify what we would like to happen and then put all of our energy into making that more likely. And that is what is called active hope, as opposed to passive hope, where you just sit back and hope that someone else will sort things out. And I should also say that right now we also have an historic opportunity. Given that the world has to make major changes to our system in order to save ourselves, this is also an unprecedented chance for social movements to create a fundamentally better and more humane society. And I think, the coronavirus has just showed us just how vulnerable we are, and that it's also possible to make very quick changes quite all over the world. And I think, all crises bring with them the opportunity to make significant changes. And which changes are made depend on which ideas are lying around at the moment. So it is our job as progressive movements to present and then push for our solutions. And right now we have an opening to change things that were not considered possible to change just a short while ago. And I like sci-fi, so I like to compare it to sort of a portal opening up to another world. But just like in all sci-fi fantasies, a portal will not remain open for long. We have to use it while we have the time. So in conclusion, when we build a society that respects nature, we can at the same time make sure that it respects people too. And right now we are at a point in time where radical improvements are possible. So I want you to have that feeling with you. So that concludes my talk, and thank you for listening all this time.